Call the roll.
Commissioner Dondekar,
Here.
Commissioner Hopkins,
Here.
Commissioner Khan,
Here.
Commissioner Shoresman,
Here.
Commissioner Wolkin.
Here.
Let the record show Vice Chair Quincy is absent. Chair Jorgensen.
Here. Thank you. So let the record reflect that commissioners are present through teleconferencing. I'd like to remind my fellow commissioners and staff to help us reduce background noise by muting your phone or microphone unless you are speaking. Accordingly, we'll try to handle the Pledge of Allegiance that way. Do I have a volunteer? How about Michelle? Would you be willing to lead the Pledge of Allegiance?
Oh boy, sure. No pressure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. So the next item is public comment. This is the time when we'll hear any public comment for items that are not on tonight's agenda. Items raised are generally referred to staff, and if action by the commission is necessary, it may be scheduled for a future meeting. Kevin, are there any public comments in the hopper?
There's no public comments as yet. Let me just remind the attendees that if they wish to make a public comment for an item not on the agenda, they need to raise their virtual hand, and then I will call on you. We'll give you just a few seconds to go ahead and do so if you'd wish to. There are no public comments.
Okay. Then we'll move to the consent agenda. Let me just first say that Michael Hopkins doesn't have a working camera on his computer right now, so we just see him by name only, not in person. Well, he's here though, and he can speak. So we have consideration of the minutes for August 25th. So are there any comments or edits on the minutes? Seeing none, do I have a motion to approve?
I'll move approval.
So Commissioner Wolkin moves approval.
I'll second that.
Commissioner Shoresman seconds. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Carries unanimously. So now we move to public hearings, item 4. I want to read something first, though, for everybody's benefit. Any court challenge to the action taken on public hearing items on the agenda may be limited to considering only those issues raised at the public hearing or in public written correspondence delivered to the city of San Luis Obispo at or prior to the public hearing. If you wish to speak, please give your name and address for the record. Please limit your comments for 3 minutes. So the item tonight is at 1953 Choro Street. It's an appeal of the Community Development Director's decision to deny a director's action application regarding a request for setback exceptions to accommodate an 800 square foot accessory structure. So that's the public hearing item. I'd first like to ask each planning commissioner for any ex parte disclosures of contact with anyone who's provided information to the planning commissioners not on the record, so that information may be used as part of the decision-making process. Are there any such contacts or communications? And Michael Hopkins, I can't see you shaking your head.
Recording in progress.
That's a no. So there are none. So the way this hearing will work is we'll hear the staff report first, and then we will hear from the appellant. The appellant will have 10 minutes. I may say this again when we get to the appellant. And then after that, there'll be public comments, and then perhaps there'll be a rebuttal from the appellant if he saves some time from his 10 minutes. And then we'll go back to commission deliberations. So now I'll call on Walter Otzel to make the staff report.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, Mr. Chairman, and Commissioners. Let me share my screen here and we can get this presentation going. Okay. All right. Tell me if you're seeing something other than a slide with the application file number and all of that. So with that, this item before you is an appeal of the Community Development Director's decision denying a request for exceptions from setback standards to accommodate a large prefabricated metal garage structure at 1953 Choro Street. The appeal was filed by the property owner, Todd Miller, on denial of the director's action application. The commission is asked to consider the appeal and decide whether to grant the appeal or uphold the director's decision. The staff will be recommending that the appeal be denied and that the director's decision denying the setback exception be upheld, as to be discussed further in this presentation. The subject site is a residential parcel on the west side of Choro Street, north of High Street, in a medium density residential zone, R2. It's developed with a single family dwelling built between 1890 and 1910, which was moved to the site in the 1990s. The property was subsequently designated as a master list historic resource, with the house noted as a good example of Queen Anne Victorian style and being associated with an early farming family of immigrants in the local area. In July of 2019, code enforcement staff observed a large accessory structure being installed in the corner of the rear yard and issued a stop work order noting that no permit had been obtained for the work and that the structure had been placed within the required side and rear setbacks. In September 2019, Mr. Miller filed a director's action application with the Planning Division, requesting a reduction in side and rear setbacks from the standard 5 feet down to 18 inches to accommodate the carport structure. The application was determined to be incomplete pending further required information, including information about building colors and materials, which would be particularly relevant to its compatibility with the historical character of the house on the property. In September of 2020, the owners submitted plans and information in response to that incomplete letter, and the application was determined to remain in an incomplete state, with staff noting the requirement for review by the Cultural Heritage Committee due to the apparent incompatibility between the proposed accessory structure and the primary dwelling in terms of form, massing, colors, and materials. Mr. Miller made contact with planning staff again in April 2021, providing photos of the completed garage structure and encouraging a follow-up site visit to view the site and the structure. And a site visit was conducted, which confirmed that the structure was placed within the required setbacks and that it exhibited a scale and architectural character that were not entirely consistent with the historical character of the property that was set by the primary dwelling. Based on the information available in the application file and the observations made during the site visit, the director's action application for setback reductions was ultimately denied, as the required findings could not be made either for the setback exception or the required director's action findings. All these required findings have been provided as attachment F, staff report for this item. This slide here only summarizes the 4 main findings that gave us difficulty in arriving at, which we ultimately could not arrive at the findings. Mr. Miller appealed this decision, citing the 4 findings upon which the denial of the application was based. One of the required findings that must be made in order to grant a setback exception is that for a single story accessory structure, that the structure is consistent with the traditional development pattern of the neighborhood. Here on this slide is an attempt to characterize the development pattern of the neighborhood, which exhibits a somewhat mixed pattern with older single family dwellings predominant along the front setback and a collection of smaller accessory structures or larger residential structures with additional units behind those primary dwellings. Some accessory structures within setbacks are observed in the area, and in this slide, I've tried to separate those with orange being some of the just small accessory structures that one might see. Many of them are within setbacks. The blue ones are larger structures that typically have dwelling units. Anyhow, the instances of the buildings in the setbacks are limited to smaller structures, which are typically smaller garages or sheds, often predating the city's first setback standards, which makes them now considered legally non-conforming. Larger structures, including the additional dwellings, such as these ones in blue, are consistent with current setback regulations, which call for side and rear setbacks at a minimum 5-foot depth at the ground floor. City records do include some minor setback exceptions granted in the past for some properties on the block. Most really during the 70s and the 80s, when zoning regulations had a more stringent 10-foot setback standard that applied in certain circumstances, such as near doors or building entries. You actually had to have a 10-foot setback in those cases. The zoning regulations were modified after that time to follow a uniform 5-foot ground level setback standard through the entire R2 zone. And in none of these cases of exceptions were ground level setbacks shallower than 5 feet permitted. And again, that is the current standard in the R2 zone. This proposed accessory structure at about 800 square feet in area is about double the typical size of the small legally non-conforming accessory structures found in the area. Its metal material also departs from the conventional residential wood masonry building materials that predominate in the area. And for these reasons, the building to be accommodated could not be found consistent with the traditional development pattern of the neighborhood. Another required finding calls for considering and addressing potential impacts to surrounding properties. And in this case, the proposed accessory structure is unusually large, and its metal material makes it more noticeable amongst the wood and masonry buildings in the area. Placement of the building almost directly against the side and rear property lines exaggerates visual and scale impacts to neighboring properties. And given this, a setback reduction could not be found to consider or address such impacts. In principle, exceptions and variances are typically meant to provide relief from physical constraints or circumstances that make strict adherence to a standard or requirement impractical or infeasible. Accordingly, a setback exception is subject to a required finding that site characteristics or physical improvements make conformance to setback requirements impractical or feasible. Here, with a relatively flat rectangular lot of conventional dimensions, developed with only a modest single-family size, developed with only a modestly sized single-family dwelling, such circumstances or constraints do not appear to exist, and this finding could not be made. And finally, the massing, form, and materials of this large metal structure could not be found to be consistent with policies of the general plan for preservation of historical resources, like the master list Oliver House on this site. The city's historic preservation program guidelines, which implement the general plan's preservation policies, require that new accessory structures on listed properties complement the primary structure's historic character. The floor area of this accessory structure is about 70% of the dwelling area of that of the dwelling itself. So it's somewhat outsized in scale in relation to the house. The character of its utilitarian metal exterior has no apparent relationship to that exhibited by the wood-sided and modestly decorated Victorian Oliver House. And with this mismatch in form, massing, and materials, an affirmative finding regarding consistency with historical preservation policies could not be made. In conclusion, the setback exception requested under the director's action application could not be approved in this case because several of the required findings for discretionary setback exceptions could not be made. Staff finds no indication in the appeal that was filed indicating any misapplication of standards or other error in reaching this decision. And accordingly, staff is recommending that the director's decision to deny the application be upheld, as no basis for making the required findings for the exception is found. Alternatively, the commission may wish to continue consideration of the item with relevant direction to staff and the appellant. However, it should be noted that before any positive action could be taken on any exception for this proposed structure, the proposal would have to be reviewed by the Cultural Heritage Committee due to this large size of the structure, which exceeds 450 square feet, and its location on a masterless property. The committee would consider the proposed work and provide a recommendation to the final decision maker, whoever that would be, about consistency with historical preservations and policies and guidelines. And that concludes my presentation. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Walter, are there questions of staff?
I have a couple of questions, Mr.
Michael.
Chairman.
Mike, welcome, please.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the timeline correctly. So according to the staff report in your presentation, there was a stop work order issued and while the structure was being built, but it was not finished at that time. Is that correct? When the stop work order was issued, it was only partially built?
Yes.
Okay, and then after that, I believe you said that the appellant now filed a request for an exception, and it was deemed to be incomplete at the time, and it remained that way for a while. But sometime in the interim, apparently, the structure was completed. So did the city allow for the structure to be completed in the interim, or did the applicant just decide to complete the structure while the exception request was on hold?
It's my understanding that the applicant completed the structure during that time. There was no permit or permission issued to complete the work.
Okay, all right. Thanks for clarifying that. One other question. If we were not dealing with an exception request now, and the applicant came in today and wanted to get a permit for an accessory structure like this, would they have to comply with the historic preservation guidelines in that case? This is assuming there's no exception request. If they came in with an accessory structure of 800 square feet and it was metal like this structure and it met the setback requirements, would there be any requirements for consistency with the historic preservation guidelines?
Yes, there would, by really the committee's application of these policies on master list properties. Really any accessory structure is subject to their review for that consistency. Only in the most obvious cases might the director have some latitude to determine CHC review would not be necessary, but in most cases, we would bring it to the CHC.
Okay, thank you very much.
Are there other questions of staff?
Yeah, can I follow up on that question? So if I'm understanding correctly, based on what Commissioner Wilkin just said and what your response was, if this property owner were to want to build a similar structure right now, they would have to submit an application for a permit first, and then it would likely go to the CHC for review before any decisions would be made whether or not the permit would be granted. And then they could, if it was granted, then they could begin building, correct?
Yeah, in a case like this, a building permit is required for a structure this size, and we would get a routine routing of those permit application plans for review. And that's when we would essentially flag it as, hold on, we've got a master list property here. We need to look at CHC review before a permit is issued.
And at the time in 2019, when the structure was begun, was there a similar requirement at that point to get a permit? And did the appellant get a permit?
Yeah, that permit requirement was definitely in place at that time, and no permit was obtained for this building.
Okay. And then there were some public comments about the consistency of this building and some of the consistency with the design guidelines or the building styles in that neighborhood. And some of the comments were pointing out that there are several buildings around this particular address that do not necessarily exhibit the Victorian style or the style that is sort of characterizing the neighborhood. And so if I'm understanding you correctly from your presentation, that most of those structures were built when the setback requirements and the building character requirements were put in place.
It appears that that's the likely case when we're talking about the accessory structures in the area. So they, on one hand, are not metal in material. They have conventional wood frame construction that goes along with the primary residence. And again, the scale is also an important factor, so that any, let's say, mismatch or departure from that conventional material that we find there, i.e. with the metal, is somewhat amplified by the large scale of the building. So those are the main differences with those other accessory structures observed in the area.
Okay, and so another term that you used, and we've heard it a lot here at the Planning Commission, but I don't know that it's something that the general public really understands, is legally non-conforming. Can you describe or give a little definition of what that means and how this is or is not legally non-conforming?
Yeah, really, in short, it's a structure that doesn't conform to current development standards, and setback standards are one of those. And so there was a time when the city had no zoning regulations and no setback standards, and lots of buildings were built at that time. When such standards are implemented, they're not retroactively applied. The existing structures that were legally built are considered legally non-conforming, even though they don't meet the current standard.
So they're sort of grandfathered in. So
exactly. Yeah, that's the term that's commonly used.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
That's it for me.
Thank you. Further questions? Okay, well then let's go ahead. Well, now we'll hear from the appellant, Mr. Todd Miller.
I'm sorry, Chair Jorgensen. Chair, yes, Commissioner Dondekar had some comments. She had an audio issue.
I'm sorry, I was muted.
And you disappeared on
I
my
was
screen.
just waving my hand.
Sorry.
I had two questions of Mr. Otsel. I was on the Historic Commission when we passed the Historic Commission guidelines. And this property falls outside the Railroad Historic District, doesn't it?
It does, okay. Yes.
So the general guidelines for historic properties are at work here rather than for a particular zone.
Well, our guidelines, the Historic Preservation Program guidelines, do say that construction on listed properties is to be subject to the same guidelines as apply in a historic district. So when we have listed properties, particularly master list properties, it's as if they're in a historic zone. They just don't have that surrounding district that they contribute to per se. They're sort of a singular entity in that respect.
Right. And this is on the master list.
Yes.
The second question was, I guess, what recourse is there for the city if the commission agrees with the findings? And I perhaps should have asked this earlier of the attorneys, but maybe it's important for the rest of the panel to know too. What recourse does the city have?
I am not 100% certain, and I think the recourse would be something important to the applicant. What would be the expectation of the applicant? And the short answer is that they're expected to correct the violation that was observed. This all stems from a stop work order and a notice of violation for the lack of permit and the setback provisions. And so I have to say that that is a pretty a pretty tough barrier to get over, that setback standard when it's already been installed within the setbacks. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I am not sure.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Emma. Sorry I missed you. I couldn't get everybody's picture on the screen at the same time,
Well, that's fine.
and you were waving badly. Any other questions from commissioners? Okay, now I'm going to turn with Kevin's help to the appellant, who has 10 minutes to make any kind of presentation. And if the appellant wishes, he could save a couple minutes of that time for any rebuttal of anything that's, for instance, came up in public comments. So, Mr. Miller, are you available to speak?
Hi, this is Deputy Clerk Christian. I am going to promote the person identified as Kate Miller to panelist. And once I've just promoted you, and you'll have to accept that. Once you accept it, then you'll be a panelist and you can share your video. And if you wish to make a presentation, you're also allowed to go ahead and share your screen and make a presentation. And as the chair noted, you will have 10 minutes. And if you wish to hold any of that for rebuttal to any further public comment that may be made, let me know now and we'll time that accordingly.
Hi, so are you both going to speak? You're welcome to.
I'll just be the one speaking. Thank you.
Sure. Good. Welcome.
Yes,
Please go ahead.
thank you. Before we continue, Michelle and I know each other from the local running club. Should we bring that to the forefront, or is it fine for what we're doing here tonight?
The issue would be whether there's been any discussion of this matter between the two of you. And I asked that question earlier and got a negative response.
There hasn't.
So I didn't recognize the name, so I didn't realize until I saw them on the screen here. And so no, we haven't discussed this.
Yeah.
If I could chime in real quick too,
Sure.
So long as Commissioner Shoresman feels that she can make an impartial decision in light of her personal relationship with Mr. Miller, then there's no reason that she can't participate in the hearing.
Very good.
Good. Thanks for raising the question. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good. Okay, I will just for a moment go through the city, Walter's list of items that were presented to you. There's a number of inaccuracies that I want to call out. The first one I want to address is this accusation that I continued to build the garage after the stop work notice without any authorization. And Walter was made aware of this early on when he and I began communicating in April, that I was given permission to finish the structure by planner Kyle, I might be pronouncing his last name wrong, but Leeuwen. He told me to go ahead and finish it. And that was back in September of 2019 when I submitted the plans and paid the $891 fee. So that's why the building has been finished, is because I was actually given permission by the planning department. Not only that, but Kyle said he would have no problem getting this building through the process of being inside the setbacks, because he understood how things were built in the backyards of these neighborhoods on these narrow lots, and that it was very common for buildings to be built on the property lines. And there were plenty of examples. I even at that time offered to take photographs and submit them for him. And he said he wouldn't need that because he understood that that was how the city allowed, especially garages, to be built, because it's difficult to jockey a car in and out of the garage when you have to come in down a narrow driveway, curve around the back of a home. And especially in my case, there is a giant Canary Islands palm tree just behind the home. So the garage has to be over to the side as far as possible and rearward as far as possible in order to make the garage available to vehicle ingress and egress. So with that question sort of answered, I'll just run through these as quickly as possible. I don't know if you have this in front of you, what the city developed for you to review. They list my site as 7,500 square feet and being a standard 50 by 150 lot. It is actually not a standard size lot. The city allowed my next door neighbor to pour his concrete driveway 1.5 feet into my lot in order to develop his rear yard and build the giant house that he's built in his back lot. So my property is actually only about 48 and a half feet wide due to that impingement with his driveway. So my lot is smaller than standard, and it's not listed here in the paperwork. So I wanted to clear that up. Walter has listed incorrectly the date that I filed for the application as the 9th of September. That was actually done on the 3rd of September, and that's when Kyle gave me permission to finish the building. And we discussed that there would be no problem getting the building through the process. Walter's information to you also deletes or omits all of the meetings that I had with the planning department prior to Walter being on board with this project just in April of 2021. I actually was assigned first to Kyle, then to Cassidy McSturdy, and Cassidy and I met with the fire marshal, and the fire marshal, Roger Maggio, acted as the building department representative as well, and we talked in great detail about the project. There was no mention at that time of the project being removed or that there was a problem with the project being within the 5-foot setbacks to the side and to the rear. We discussed softening the look of the project towards High Street with plantings, and Roger wanted a 1-hour fire wall built inside the building, and we concurred that 5/8 inch thick sheetrock would accomplish that task. So at no point in time during these initial meetings was there any representation by the city that this building would not be allowed due to natures of the neighborhood, historic character of the home listed on master list of historic properties. And I made it clear the home was on the master list of historic properties on the 6th of July, the day after I was red tagged, when I contacted Steve Sheets via email and talked about the project, told him that I would be in on the following Monday to discuss it and get the ball rolling with complying with the city's regulations. So at no point have I attempted to hide or cloak the fact that this home is on the master list of historic properties. The fourth item that I see has been omitted is that there's been no comment regarding the giant palm tree in the backyard, which we saved and moved when we moved the house onto the property at the behest of the city. That palm tree is in the way of the building being moved inward and more forward on the property, as I previously discussed. It will block the ingress and egress of vehicles coming in and out of the garage. Moving down the list, there is mention of adverse visual scale effects. My lot slopes to the rear, so this building almost can't be seen at all, except for from High Street. If you're traveling in a car, literally you have about 1.5 seconds to look for, find, recognize the building. The building can't be seen from Choro Street at all. And because of how my lot slopes away from my home, the building is actually much smaller than the home, unless you're standing directly in front of it, and you would have to be in my backyard in order to do that. So the building being represented in the photos is not actually the scale of the building to the house or to the property. There's been comment about how the building doesn't match with the surrounding historical nature of the neighborhood. The historical nature of the neighborhood contains everything from the spectrum of the last 100 years of development of the neighborhood. So I have funny looking mansard roof apartment buildings directly across from me. I have an 1880s Victorian home at the corner of Choro and Upham. I have a bizarre 2-story Cal Poly-esque project 1970s house directly adjacent to my backyard that's so large it looks down into my home and into my backyard. And that home sits to the rear of a 1920s vintage home, but that was allowed. There are metal buildings in our street. There are converted, what appear to be either animal barns or chicken coops that Cal Poly students live in, one of which actually hangs over the fencing onto the Qualinos property that's on the Santa Barbara Street side. So those are all part of this street and the, quote, historic nature of the neighborhood. I've spoke with my surrounding neighbors. Some of them didn't even know the garage was in place because it's not visible, and it's so well hidden in the backyard by the fencing, by the morning glory that's growing on it, which is something Cassidy McSturdy and I talked about doing, was having planting that softened the view of the building to the rest of the neighborhood. And
Mr. Miller, you have about 2 minutes left. Just
okay. So I guess I will save my remaining time for any questions that there might be.
Good. Let's do that. And if the staff, if we ask you questions, that's not part of the 2 minutes. You still got time for rebuttal if need be. So in that case, are there questions of the appellant from the commission? Oh, sorry, wait. I need to do this in a different order. We need to hear, Kevin, can you tell us if there are any folks who wish to make public comments on this item?
This is Deputy Clerk Christian. Let's give the attendees just a few seconds to go ahead. And if you'd like to speak, raise your hand and I'll call on you and promote you to a panelist so that you may speak. Just give them a few seconds. There's just a few. Seeing no hands, we have no comments.
Okay. So commissioners, do you have questions of the appellant? Steve.
Thank you. Do you have something in writing from Kyle that says go ahead and build it without a building permit?
No, we had a conversation at the counter when I was paying my fee and turning in my plans, and I simply asked him if he minded if I finished it because it looked bad sitting as just frames. And he said, go ahead and finish it. I'll have no problem getting this through. And I have emails talking to Steve Sheets that same morning, thanking them for meeting with me and letting him know that Kyle had said to go ahead and finish the building. So this was all above board.
Okay. And who is Steve Sheets?
He's a code enforcement officer who originally red tagged the project.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. And you testified that because of the palm tree, you could not build that structure within 5-foot setbacks of your side and backyard and be able to get vehicles in because of the palm tree.
That's correct.
Okay. That's all I have.
Commissioners, this is Deputy Clerk Christian. I just wanted to make you aware that Steve Sheets is actually in attendance should you have any questions that need to be directed towards him directly that Walter is unable to provide answers for.
I have one question, if that's okay.
Yes.
So it sounds like you were not informed of the setback requirements for this building at the time of the stop order. When and maybe even after that, when were you informed that the structure was built outside of the setback requirements?
Oh, that was initially with Steve Sheets' red tag notice. It was right on the red tag notice, and it may even be in the paperwork that you received from Walter there. I believe there's a photo of the red tag notice, and it says structure being built inside the setback requirements. So that was always above board from the very beginning, and that's what Steve and Kyle and I talked about, was that, you know, buildings in this neighborhood have been allowed to be built inside these setbacks for a reason. And it's because, especially with garages, it's very difficult to get a vehicle in and out of a garage when you have to curve the vehicle around the back corner of a home.
And which tree is it that would be in the way? Is it, looks like there's two from the overhead photos. There's one in the front of the yard and one in the back. Are you talking about the one behind?
Right, the one in the behind is the one that we used a crane to dig up and move to that location to save it.
Okay, I don't think I have any other questions. Thank you.
Further
Hello.
questions?
Chair Jorgensen?
Yes, please.
I don't have any specific questions, but I did want to give Steve Sheets maybe an opportunity to just respond to some of the conversation, just with a little bit of the back and forth. I want to make sure we have all the information available prior to making a decision. So if Steve Sheets would like to speak, I'd be interested to hear what he has to say.
If I could add to that, Mr. Chairman,
yeah.
Which is if Steve could give us clarification. My understanding was that would a structure this size require a building permit before you start construction? What is the normal conventional sequence of events? If Steve or somebody else could clarify for us.
I see Steve Sheets here, so please go ahead.
This is Steve Sheets. Thank you all. Any building over 120 square feet would flag the requirement for a permit. Additionally, any electrical that would be added to it would also require a permit. Speaking to, I believe, Shorsman's question, the stop work did have the setback requirement on there, or the setback violation on there. And speaking to Mr. Miller's set approval to get to finish working, he did email me on September 3rd of 2019 asking for permission to put the sides up, quote, so that I can close it up and have it look nice, end quote. And I responded to him with the stop work order still in place. I cannot give permission for work to continue until the setback is approved and the permit is issued. The structure should remain as is, end quote. So if he got permission from Kyle Van Leeuwen, that's beyond my knowledge, but that's the say that I had in it.
Thank you. Any questions to Steve from the commissioners?
Yeah, I don't know if this is to Steve, but just in general, I mean, this all occurred back in 2019. And I'm just curious about, is this normal? Is this a normal amount of time frame to have passed between the time a violation is noted and an appeal or a final decision is made?
Looks like Brian wants to chime in on that.
Commissioner Shorsman, I can address that. Typically, we have an applicant that kind of drives the process, wants to see a review hearing go on to have a decision made so that the project can be completed. This is a little bit different, of course, because the structure was already in place. It was flagged with the stop work. It was completed shortly thereafter with the structure essentially in place. We didn't have an applicant or property owner kind of driving that process. There was a couple of planners that kind of worked on the project, as Walter reviewed in his presentation. There was some back and forth, some completeness comments, but there really wasn't a process that was sort of driving that decision to be made. And really, when Walter got this project and took this on, we took a look at the status of the application. Where are we? Do we have enough information to make a decision to bring this project through the process? And we had determined we did have enough information to go ahead and move forward. Walter visited the property, met with the property owner to try to understand if there was some additional information that could be taken into account in making this decision. Another thing that kind of contributed to that, I want to address some of the comments. Steve Sheets answered sort of, I think, the questions, the assertions that the property owner made about being given permission to complete the structure. On the planning side, my understanding is this conversation took place at the counter between the property owner and Kyle Van Leeuwen. At the time, he was an assistant planner in taking the application. He wasn't assigned to the project. He wasn't aware of all the details. I've spoken with Kyle Van Leeuwen about this project, and he has indicated that he did not expressly give permission to build a structure. He's very well aware that he does not have that authority. It was clear when the application went in that it required action by the director and that it wouldn't be possible for a staff member at the counter to grant permission to continue building a structure. So I hope that's helpful with a little bit of the background.
Further questions from commissioners?
I have a question for staff. Again, I'm confused about process. So if requiring to get a permit is needed for a structure 120 square feet, and an owner decides to build something, and what is the sort of chain of events? How is this brought to the attention of the city? What recourse does the city have to require the owner to conform if the owner is not aware of the laws? Because if a permit is legally required, how does the city go about informing the owner they need to get a permit and that they're not in conformance, etc.? Please enlighten me a bit on that.
I can definitely do that. It was brought to our attention by, I'm assuming, a neighbor. They sent in an email saying that the structure was being built. So I went out and investigated, and that's how I became aware of it. As far as the notice goes, I posted the stop work on site, and then after that, I followed up with what's called a notice of violation. So we send them a notice. It outlines the code that's in violation and the fact that they need to get a permit. So usually with that comes a 30-day deadline. Of course, if there's contact with the property owner, they're working on it, we can extend that. But they're advised of the requirement through 1, the stop work, and 2, a follow-up notice of violation. And as far as enforcement goes, if they refuse to comply, the city can move forward with administrative citations. It starts out at 100, and then the second one is 500, and then the third one is 1,000, and they're all spaced usually at least 10 days apart to give them time for the appeal process. But after that, it can be $1,000 a day per violation.
And the notice of violation was sent out on what date?
The notice of violation was sent out the same day as the stop work order was posted. So that was July 5th of 2019.
Do you know when the construction was completed on the...
I don't. Sometime after September of 2019, I'm assuming, after he requested my permission. So sometime after that.
Thank you very much.
So
I have one last question. I guess it's for
please,
staff.
Commissioner Shorsman.
So is the expectation that if we deny the appeal, that the property owner would need to take the structure down or move it, or what is the outcome?
Yes, if it's denied, then the way to fix it would be to remove the structure.
Or have it conform in some way?
It could be, I can't speak to the planning aspects of it, but in order for it to not require a permit, again, it would 20 square feet, there would need to be no electrical. And we would also need it to be outside of the required setback.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you for a moment. You froze. Would you mind repeating that? Sorry.
I'm sorry. It said my internet was unstable. So in order to negate the need for a permit, it would need to be under 120 square feet with no electrical or plumbing going to it. And in order for the zoning regulations to be met, it would need to be outside of the 5-foot setback.
So the property owner could apply for a permit and adjust the structure to meet the setback requirements and any other electrical or other requirements that were necessary. It would just be like starting over with the process.
I can't speak to the planning aspect of it, but as far as code enforcement goes, they could apply for a permit. Whether it would be approved or not is not something that I can speak on.
Would Walter be able to answer that or no?
Maybe I can try to answer that.
Yeah.
So essentially, we'd be looking at a different project. The structure could be relocated. We could get a new application that included relocating the structure. Not sure how feasible that would be based on the construction type here, or a new type of structure that is outside the setbacks. And then that would sort of initiate that process. If no exceptions were needed, we didn't need to look at any of the findings for a setback exception. At that point, we'd be also looking at the required findings under the historic preservation ordinance for the structure being complementary with the primary structure as called for in the historic preservation guidelines. That would really be the focus of the review at that point if we had a structure that was conforming.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions at this point.
Sorry, I do have one
sorry,
final
good.
question.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, this is for staff, and I was wondering if staff had a detailed site plan that shows the relation of the accessory structure to the other features on the site, such as the palm tree, and what those clearances are, and whether staff could explain if there's enough, what those clearances are, and does it actually impede access to the garage?
Yeah, I'll let Walter chime in, and maybe he can show the site plan as well. I just also wanted to add in from the historic structure standpoint, this kind of gets to the size of the structure and having available space in the backyard. The historic preservation guidelines actually state that an accessory structure, sort of what was envisioned, are buildings that are 450 square feet or less. The zoning code would still define this as an accessory structure, but I just point that out to kind of make the point that this is quite a large additional building to be adding to the back of a property. So it's not necessarily the question of can an 800 square foot structure fit within setbacks and meet all of the site constraints. It's could necessarily be a smaller structure or something that's more of the size that's more typically seen in the rear yard areas of historic buildings.
Yeah, thank you. I understand.
And I do have the site plan on the screen, so I'll go ahead and share the screen if that works, and see if we can look at this site plan. All right, so I think that does the trick. I'll zoom in on the area in question here. I think I'll zoom in. There we go. Give you a little overview here. So the driveway leads down next to the house. This, I believe, represents the palm tree. And then we have concrete slab, and here's the building here. What's not shown is the canopy of the tree, but this thing's kind of limited to the trunk below 20 feet.
I have a question. Is the carport, is it got a concrete foundation on it?
To my knowledge, yes.
Thank you. I thought it did, but I just wanted to make sure.
So if there's other parts of the site plan you want to look at, let me know. I can navigate around or zoom in or out.
So on the site plan, it says one palm, I guess a palm tree, I can't read the detail, was removed to site the relocated residence.
That's right. These look like, originally these plans were drawn as part of the 90s relocation of the house to the site.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously there's not a palm tree underneath the house.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. So I'd like to go back to the appellant, Mr. Miller, if he would like to make any comments or answer any questions.
And, Mr.
yes.
Chair,
I'm
is
sorry.
it possible to ask the appellant a question
Sure.
at this time, or should we wait till he's finished presenting? Is it okay to ask a question directly?
I don't think that's a problem. I think we'll have a better outcome if you just go ahead and ask a question.
So my question, Mr. Miller, was, were you not aware of the process of getting permits for structures such as this in your backyard? Was this?
I have always had a carport of the same style, just slightly smaller, in the same location on the property, literally going back 20 years. And there's never been an issue with it. I didn't know that these would be considered temporary structures because they're just screwed together in a few hours. I didn't know that they fell under building codes or constraints. They're not electrified. They don't have plumbing or sewer or anything like that. It's just a place to park and store a vehicle. So when I removed that carport that was there and put up what, in my opinion, was a much nicer looking building, I considered it the same thing, that it was also just one of these temporary structures that didn't fall into this purvey of required building permits, which is why I began working on it. The size of the structure, it's not like I'm trying to sneak in past the city or anybody else. And so, yeah, I just began building it. And then when I got red tag, stopped until I was told to go ahead. And this question about when did I get permission or not permission, and the whole red tagging process, if I wasn't given permission, then why didn't code enforcement come back as soon as they saw the building complete and begin fining me for violating their red tag of the project? So I hope that answers your question.
There are other questions of commissioners while we're in direct contact this way? Good. Well, then, please, Mr. Miller, if you'd like to make any other comments or any other responses to what you heard, please do go ahead.
Yes, there's been a lot of comments about the building being metal and how that doesn't conform with the Victorian and these guidelines. The guidelines are not laws about what should happen on a property, in my opinion. And also, owning a Victorian should not be some sort of punitive event. Victorians have been around this area about 120 years. That doesn't mean that they have not been exposed to all manner of construction going up around them, from gas stations and industrial things to all manner of homes from different decades and eras and architecture. And if you'll notice in the front view of my building, I was in the process of making it look like a vintage shop. So that is a fake clock on the front of it. The lighting is, it's real lighting, but it's fake. The building's not going to ever have electricity or anything like that. It's just to store my vintage cars in there. And the building can become more vintage looking as I'm left to do what I did. I took the house that I have that was going to be bulldozed and had homeless people living in it. And it, as you've seen in the photos, turned out quite nice. And so I have great respect for my home, love how it turned out. And the metal building was not to fly in the face of the neighborhood or the home. It was because I have a vision of the Victorian home could have this cool metal shop type structure in with it, and that would be very fitting. In fact, when this house was a farmhouse, it was not as decorated as it is now. It was clad in asbestos tile siding. It had a metal, I think they called it a fuel shed or a fuel barn next to it. It had giant horse and dairy barns around it. A giant water tank was there with it. So this house has always been around, sort of industrial farm type things. And that was the endeavor with the metal garage, was that it could be this sort of functional item, but it could also be kind of cool and vintage looking. And I'm very good at restoration work. I'm very good at making stuff look vintage and kind of dialing in the whole project to suit my property. And the neat thing about it is that it's very hidden on my property. I'm not sitting on a street corner. There's not this giant, massive structure sitting out for everybody to trip over. It's very hidden on my property, and you can't see it unless you're actually standing in my backyard. Even the views on High Street, which we can upload if we're given the opportunity, will show that the building is almost not visible right now on High Street just due to changes in planting in the last year and a half.
Thank you. Any further questions from the commission to Mr. Miller? Well, seeing none, I'm going to bring it back then to the commission for deliberation. Thank you. So while we're deliberating, we can do that in several forms, but I think the point that we need to make here is that there are 4 findings that would have to be made to uphold the appeal or deny the appeal. The first one is compatibility with the neighborhood. The second one is kind of adverse visual and scale effects on the immediate neighbors. The third one is whether there are any characteristics or existing improvements, I suppose that could include the canary palm, that make strict adherence to the setback rules not feasible. And the last one is the compatibility with the historic protection guidelines or regulations or whatever they turn out to be for compatible structures. And whether scale is part of that. So those are the 4, and the more we can speak to those, the more we can maybe kind of organize this and figure out where we are. So who'd like to begin? Walter, I see your hand raising for a second. Then I see Marky. Marky, please.
Yeah, thanks for stating the required findings. I just wanted to clarify that for the finding regarding strict adherence to the zoning regulations being impractical or infeasible, if that's the case, you also have to find that the project nonetheless conforms with the intent of the regulations. So I just wanted to clarify that that is part of that finding.
Oh, thank you for that. Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't see anyone wishing to speak. Should the chair jump in?
I'll start it off. I'll say something.
Please.
So just focusing on the findings right now, I think some of the findings, one could make an argument for either way, and maybe there's a fair argument to be made on things like consistent with the character of the neighborhood, and there's another one about consistent with the traditional development pattern of the neighborhood, and maybe the one about the compatibility with the Victorian is maybe a little more maybe a little more clear cut, but the one I'm having problems with is the finding about existing site characteristics or improvements making the compliance with the setback requirements infeasible. That one I'm just not seeing, despite the location of the palm tree. I just don't see why on a lot like that, a smaller structure or even this size structure could not have been located and meeting the 5-foot setbacks. So that one, I'm having a problem making that finding in the affirmative, not even considering about the intent with the consistency with the intent of the regulations, just the part about the site characteristics making compliance infeasible, or the language used in the finding is impractical or infeasible. So that one I'm having trouble with. So that's my comment right now. I understand from the testimony there's a dispute about whether the appellant was given permission or not, but I'm not sure that is a big factor in my thinking right now about this. I think the fact is that a permit was not applied for, and the structure, a large structure, twice the size of a regular garage, went in. And I'm having problems making that finding about site characteristics. It's finding, well, it's 17-108-040A4. is
Kind of the
finding.
third, it's the, in larger terms, it's the third category of finding that is part of the staff report.
So that's all I'll say for now.
Who's next? Steve Kahn.
I'll make mine brief. I agree with Commissioner Wolken.
That's brief.
Can I
Commissioner
ask a
Schwarzman.
question of Commissioner Wilken and Khan? I guess a little clarification. So are you saying that you do not, that about the fourth condition, the absence of site characteristics or improvements that make adherence to zoning regulations impractical or infeasible, you believe that it would be practical and feasible to move the structure or make it that you could make it conforming?
Oh, well,
Or
I can't really speak to how practical it would be to move the structure, given that it's on a foundation. But my point is that there's nothing unique or unusual about the site that would merit, in my opinion, granting the exception. There's nothing about the site that makes it impossible to, or unfeasible to meet the setback requirements. I mean, putting aside the fact that the building's already there, I don't think there's anything unusual about the site. Its topography, its dimensions, the location of the building on the site, the size of the Victorian house, that makes it impractical to have put in a conforming structure.
so you think you could have the location of the palm tree is irrelevant, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think, well, just looking at the site plan right now, just given the existing structure, I think it's still possible. It would still be possible to get a car in there. I'm just looking at the site plan, but I think to me, the more relevant question is, well, the applicant could have put in a regular size 400 square foot garage and easily met the setback requirements. And there's nothing about the site that would have prevented that.
Thank you for that clarification.
Hello, Chair Jorgensen.
Yes.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Hopkins, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm in full agreement with Commissioner Wolken and Khan when it comes to this decision. And, I guess briefly on the non-conforming use issue, when you touch an existing structure to a certain extent, it becomes a new structure that requires a permit. And just more generally, even if we were to assume some varied verbal communication from city staff, I think there's a hard evidence record in defense of upholding staff's recommendation. And, just generally, I don't feel very comfortable setting a precedent for allowing projects to be built without a permit, even, through an appeal process. So I support Commissioner Wolken's comments and staff's recommendation.
Ema.
I find it actually hard to think about any of the four conditions that and to find on the appellant's sort of buy into the appellant's argument about those four conditions. I think the lack of acquiring a permit at the inception of this project, when it's a large project, is troubling. I know that if this project comes before Historic Commission, there would be much scrutiny of the style that was adopted. And although this is admittedly a very hybrid kind of area with many different kinds of things going on, that's a kind of historic legacy of this of this neighborhood. It makes it charming, but since we've had the historic adaptation of guidelines, I think the Historic Commission would definitely look askance at the style and treatment of the structure that was proposed. So in a way, not getting a permit has sort of circumvented those processes put in place by the city, so that there's a kind of development of the neighborhood that's in congruence with what is planned. So I'm troubled by that, and I agree with Mr. Wilkin about not seeing a convincing argument here.
I'll chime in next. I find this whole situation really, really disappointing. I feel like there was clearly some miscommunication between the appellant and staff, some maybe not understanding of the rules, and I did go by a couple of times actually, and I hear and understand the public comment that was made by some of the neighbors, and can appreciate that several of the neighbors don't have a problem with the structure, are totally fine with it being there. We did get one public comment from somebody that didn't, that wasn't in favor of keeping it, but we did get several other neighbors who were perfectly fine with it, and I agree that you can't really see it much from the street, from the front, where you see the nice looking Victorian house that the appellant has put there. Unfortunately, I do feel like our job as planning commissioners is to make sure that that all the structures that come before us are built according to current guidelines, and this just doesn't seem to meet all of the guidelines and setback requirements. And so I hear all of the things that my fellow commissioners say and understand those as well. So I just I think that we as a city and as neighbors can do these things better, and I hope that we don't see too many more of these in the future. I'll just leave it at that.
Steve, are you wishing to make another comment, please?
Yeah, if I could just make a real brief comment. I know there are a lot of structures that are in violation of sheds and stuff with the setback requirements, but where the setback requirements really came from is the fire code. And the fire officials are able to get around a structure if a battle of blaze is coming from that structure or another structure. So life safety is always paramount to me. So yeah, there's existing non-conforming structures, but in general, I would like to see structures conform to that for life and safety. And so I tend to believe if there's a way he could have practically done it with giving the 5-foot setbacks, then he should have done it. And I'm concerned about life and safety.
No, okay, I'll throw in my 2 bits. I'm still of mixed mind about this. As I go through I walk the block all the way around. It's kind of a trapezoid shaped block with houses actually pointing in 3 different directions in different parts of the block. It's really very complicated, and it's a mishmash. There are mansard roofs. There's just a whole set of things. Right next door is certainly a very large apartment or house in the back. I know it's R2, but every one of those R2 seems very different from anything in the front. So that, to me, that the horse is kind of out of the barn in terms of preserving what I imagined when I was first seeing the project, seeing the appeal packet, that the length of Churro has a set of historic houses, and it's a historic street in a whole bunch of ways. Very important street. But in this area, and particularly in this kind of trapezoid block with Santa Barbara and Broad Street and High Street, and there's an awful lot going on there, and there's been a lot of development there. So when I look at the findings for compatibility with the neighborhood, I just kind of throw up my hands. When I walked around and went up the driveway where the apartments are and looked at this right next to it, I don't think it necessarily stands out more than anything else at this point. There's a whole lot of things that are not exactly the way I would love to see it. For the adverse effect on neighbors, we certainly had some testimony from written correspondence that there weren't adverse effects, so at least we have something to go on. The third, on the site character, that I think is a tough one. And I think what we're lacking here is what we would usually see in such a situation, that is architect's drawings of turning ratios and et cetera, to see what could work and where such a carport could fit, and whether the palm tree in fact is at issue. I think it's an open question, but it's hard looking at that small site plan for us to make such a decision like that. And then the compatibility with the historic protection requirements certainly is a real issue. And Brian may be right that CHC would have a set of problems. I could imagine, I guess, that the appellant could roll out some of the more industrial farming background of this particular building, but that's it's on this site now, so it's not quite clear how relevant that is. So on two of the items, the first two, I could make findings, I think, for the appellant's case. The third one, I don't feel like I have enough evidence around whether there are any site characteristics, and particularly the large canary palm, would make it a strict adherence a problem. And then the historic protection, maybe there's a case to be made. So I could imagine the possibility that we consider the alternative that was mentioned in Walter's staff report, that is, take a continuance and have it go to CHC. That might allow, and then when that's done, we'd have something from CHC in front of us. So in my mind, the third and fourth were the most problematic. I think this is what I heard, I think, in a sense, from Commissioner Wolken and from Commissioner Khan as well, that it's those two that are the hardest to imagine. And so in my mind, I could see us deciding to gather more information before we make a final decision. That's my mixed mind, 2 bits.
I could support that. I think it would be good to have another opinion on some of these, because I do think that they are somewhat subjective. And I don't know the requirements that the Cultural Heritage Committee would put this up against.
Ima.
I think just one of the findings, if people, if there's concern with just even one of the findings, I think there's an argument for supporting the director's decision on this. We don't have to find all the findings. I mean, we can have mixed opinions about it, but just the fact that a permit wasn't pulled troubles me greatly, which is item number 1. The historic preservation ordinance, I think, yes, there's an industrial character to this building, but the historic or preservation ordinance lays out what's okay to do in that area. And it doesn't, I don't think, as I recall, I was part of that group. It talks about sort of incongruence with the residential architecture that exists. It doesn't really talk about a farmscape and what might have a farm building and then what might be on a farmscape in adjacencies, and that might be replicated in the city fabric now. And I agree that there isn't an adverse effect on neighborhood properties because it's a hemmed-in site. but we did have somebody from the apartment complex concerned about the scale of the building. And really, the site is odd, but I didn't see anything on the site when I've actually spent quite a bit of time in the unit next door. It's a large building next door, but in terms of materials and overall colors, and there's a kind of fit with the more traditional architecture at the front of the building. So that even though there's a scale difference, there's an attempt to try and fit with the historic character of the building in front through the use of materials and articulation. So this building, I think, has some problems in terms of the site characteristic and I mean the historic characteristic of the neighborhood, but also I don't think there's anything that precluded going with a smaller building that would allow setbacks. I mean, the reason for turning radiuses and so on is because it's a very long building. If it was shorter by 10 feet, there wouldn't be any problem with getting into the building. That's all you need to turn a vehicle 10 or 15 feet. So I just feel like it would be important for us to make a decision here that there are quite a few reasons why this is problematic.
Mike Wilkin, looks like you got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Regarding the suggestion to refer to or continue and refer to the Cultural Heritage Commission, while it might be beneficial to get their view on the historic aspect, I don't think they would weigh in on the finding having to do with site characteristics and strict adherence to the zoning requirements. So that's still a decision we need to make. I don't know if sending it to CHC helps in that regard. I don't think it helps in that regard. I would venture to say that if this building were to somehow be able to meet the setback requirements, I would be amenable to considering its approval if it ever came back to us. Right now, all that's before us is the exception request, which I would not support for the reasons I said. But if the building could be made to meet the setback requirements, that would relieve most of my concerns about the project.
I think I agree with you, Commissioner Wilkin. That's my biggest concern, which is why I was sort of asking the questions about how could we make this work, the staff and the opponent.
Mr. Hopkins, are you?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to formulate my thought there. I agree a lot with what Commissioner Dondekar was saying, and I guess I expect if we send this to CHC, we have enough reasons to make a decision here, and I also anticipate if we send this to CHC, there's still a lot of the outstanding issues would remain unresolved in the meantime, and I think given the process that everyone on this has been through, be nice to have a resolution here tonight. And if the applicant wants to, reapply for a permit within the confines of what's allowable, then they can pursue that process. But in terms of what's before us here tonight, I just find it hard to allow this to move forward.
So who would like to make a motion?
I will. I can make the motion. 1 second to pull up the staff's recommendation. So I would like to make a motion to adopt the draft resolution denying the appeal and upholding the Community Development Director's decision to deny Director's action application regarding a request for a reduction of the required side and rear setback requirements to accommodate the placement of an accessory structure on the property at 1953 Choro.
I'd second that motion.
Commissioner Dandekar. Is there further comment or discussion? I'd say I think I'm going to oppose the motion because I just feel like I don't quite have enough information to on that, particularly on the site site characteristics. That's a key part of a waiver of any part of the zoning ordinance, and I feel like I just don't quite have enough information. So I'm going to vote against this. Are we ready to vote? Any other comments? Kevin, can you call the roll?
Commissioner Hopkins,
Yes.
Commissioner Dandekar,
Yes.
Commissioner Khan,
Yes.
thank you. Commissioner Shoresman,
Yes.
Commissioner Wolkin,
Yes.
Chair Jorgensen.
No. So the motion to deny the appeal carries.
Chair Jorgensen,
Yep.
just a point of order, is this decision appealable to the city council? Or maybe this is a question for staff. Is this appealable to the city council?
Yes, it is.
I believe so. So let's see if I've got any way to speak to that directly. Well, let's assume. So my understanding would be that this could be appealed to the city council. And I believe there's a 10-day appeal period. Is that correct, staff?
Yes, that's correct.
So that's information for the appellant if he wishes to have it. Okay. So this item then is closed and we're ready to go on to the next item, which is staff updates and agenda forecast. And that'll be from Brian Lavelle, Senior Planner.
All right, thank you, Chair Jorgensen. Your next meeting, regularly scheduled meeting, is September 22nd. And you've got a couple of sizable items there, the objective design standards. So a new section essentially that would go into the zoning regulations that would be used for ministerial review of certain qualifying housing projects. And also on that agenda, you have the Avila Ranch Development Plan, and that's all of the R2 land uses in phases 1 through 3. That's 297 residences that would be reviewed as part of that development plan as well. The next meeting is October 13th, and at this point, the only item on there is the comprehensive zoning regulations update. That's a pretty sizable update that's coming to you, kind of the main batch of, you could say, cleanup items and some needed adjustments from when the zoning code was last updated several years ago. So there's quite a lot to that item. And then just going out to the 27th of October, we have the Ag Heritage Center in the San Luis Ranch specific plan that includes the layout for the historic buildings. There's the relocated remnants of the spectator viewing barn that caught on fire or mostly burned down a couple of years ago. There's the relocated main barn and then the historic main residence to be incorporated into that center, along with some new commercial buildings. And then we're also expecting the Bullock Ranch project out of the Orcutt area specific plan. So another pretty sizable development plan with a number of residences in a specific plan. So that's about as far out as I'll go for now. And that's all I have for staff updates and agenda forecast.
Thank you. Any questions?
This is I have one quick question, Brian,
Sure.
on the zoning regulations update. Will that be going before any other advisory bodies first? Would just like to review that discussion if that's happening, and wanted to see if that was going to anyone else first.
No, that item is going strictly to the Planning Commission for recommendation to the City Council.
Okay, and then a follow-up question on that. Given the extent of the zoning regs, would it be possible to get a draft perhaps a little bit in advance of the agenda being released, even if it was just, very clearly noted as a draft and that adjustments might still be made? It'd just be nice to at least look at something and what's being proposed first before just having, a week or so to prepare.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great idea. I would expect that that's possible. I'll go ahead and inquire with the project manager on that and see if we can make that happen and give you an update on where we are on that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions? Are we good? I think then we're ready to adjourn. I'll adjourn this meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Night.
Right.
Night.
Good night.